facilitating, I should say, certainly not leading with so many leaders here, this discussion about the futures of research in inclusion. So we have some really top-notch scholars here doing research on inclusion from a lot of different angles. So without further ado, I think maybe we can start, maybe at the far end and then scoop in, just do short intros, talk a little bit about your work in this space, and maybe one thing you see as a really exciting new direction.
Thank you. Am I on? Okay, great. Thanks, Morgan, and thanks to the iSchool at Berkeley for convening this event. I just want to say that I've had a lot of uptake on Twitter today around the conversations here, and a lot of interest, so I'm hoping we can do it again and keep broadening the conversations. My name is Sarah Roberts. I come from UCLA, from the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies. My work is focused on some internet workers called commercial content moderators. And these are the people who look at, adjudicate, often delete, and make decisions about social media content that is user-generated. And it's a really tough job. And it's a job that has, for many years, existed really in the shadows and has been by design hidden in terms of kind of industry acknowledging the practices, as well as the general public being aware that work goes on. And so I appreciate being included in this event, because just a few years ago it would have been unimaginable to me to have it be at the fore of a discussion about the topic of inclusion and equity in the tech industry, for large part because I couldn't get anyone interested. And there are some bad practices on the part of some of our academic colleagues to make rhetorical comments when one is giving a talk to the effect of, why should we care? You don't need to raise your hand if anyone's ever said that to you. But I did, in early iterations of my work as a doctoral student and so on, I had some people ask, why should we care? And the argument that I made was based on sort of the humanity of workers who were being put on the front lines in a way that was sometimes, often impacting their well-being, as well as it being a demonstration, perhaps an even far more accurate demonstration of what the true nature of the social internet was, when industry was portraying something else, a space of democratic participation that welcomed all comers, for example. Well, if spaces feel like that to you, and I bet they don't feel like that to everyone here, but even if they do on occasion, it was in large part because of the work that people were doing to cull material off the internet. And then there are a host of implications around the politics of the deletion practices, and what is allowed to stand and what is removed in the context of mainstream social media platforms. So all of this goes into issues of equity and inclusion in tech, maybe from a slightly different angle, which is that of relative value or lack of value assigned to particular workers. And in the case of commercial content moderation, we're talking about a largely globalized, outsourced work practice that takes place in different places in the world, and of course in Silicon Valley, but also in places like Poland, Romania, the Philippines, India, and elsewhere, and with attendant labor conditions and rates of pay. So that's what is interesting about this particular panel and its focus on how research and industry, academic research and industry might find ways to interface, is that it's a relatively new thing for me to have industry, first of all, acknowledge the research that I do and acknowledge the practices which I research, which in large part has been the result of their hand being forced around these issues. But now that it's somewhat out of the closet, it's been relatively new for me to have industry acknowledge to me that they might need some help, around some of the social issues that, that are inherent in the very name social media, and yet are so often taken as an afterthought when they're taken up at all. So that's what I'm coming to the table with, and that's my research background, and I look forward to sharing more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rodolfo Mendoza Denton. People call me Rudy because they tend not to be able to roll their R's. And I'm a professor here at UC Berkeley in the Department of Psychology. My bread and butter has always been psychological processes around the exposure and experience of discrimination and intergroup relations, and I'm happy to talk about all that today. I have some research specifically within the tech sector, examining various forms of bias and stigma, which I'm happy to talk about today. I think I had a list of bullet points that I wanted to make sure that I got to today, but I think if there's one thing that I would like to emphasize today, and thanks for your invitation, Morgan, about that, is just the idea that at some point we need to and this has been, I think, resonating in the at least in the last panel that I going from this idea of numerical diversity to what sociologists and psychologists call relational diversity, and it has everything to do with paying attention to the well-being of employees, how we treat each other. It has to do with hiring processes, and part of that involves acknowledging that we need to move beyond implicit bias as sort of the explanatory mechanism for why people who mean well still end up not getting quite where they want to be with respect to tech. It's a more complicated process than that, and that's where I think we need to begin doing some research. The other point I want to make is that I think we really need to push our CEOs and our companies to share data in an ethically responsible way, because these patterns are not going to become evident if they're just kept in little closets. Thank you.
Great. So I'm Sapna Cherian. I'm an associate professor of psychology. I'm a social psychologist at the University of Washington. And thanks for inviting me here today. It's been great. I've learned a lot already. And my research focuses on stereotypes of computer scientists and how these stereotypes can make women and girls feel like they don't belong in the field. And the stereotypes I've specifically focused on are kind of the computer geek stereotypes. So the idea is that computer scientists are loners, and they aren't socially skilled, and they love science fiction, and they are very intensely, they've been programming since they were little kids. And those stereotypes, when you make those stereotypes salient to women, many women will end up saying, that's not who I am, I don't really fit that image, and then be less interested in computer science. And we've also looked at how to change that image, for example, using computer science environments like classrooms and departments, and if you can present a different image of computer science, for example, not putting up like Star Trek stuff, but instead putting up nature posters and art posters, students actually can get the signal that computer science is a broader field, and then they can find a way to engage with it, and it increases women's interest in it and their sense of belonging. So that's what I've done so far. In terms of the future, I'll just pick up where Rudy was going with the implicit bias thing. I totally agree with that. I mean, social psychologists kind of invented the idea of implicit and unconscious bias, and now I think we're thinking, okay, that we've gotten a lot of traction from that, but we can't just put all our eggs in that implicit bias basket, because there's so much other stuff going on. And implicit bias is a very compelling idea, the idea that we all have these biases and we might not even be aware of them, and it's these biases that are holding other people back. And I think it's very compelling because it fits kind of with the American dominant model of how we like to think about bias, that bias is something that lives in people's heads, and if we can just clean up what's in people's heads, then all of a sudden the world will be great, everything will be fine. And that's what training is supposed to do, is like clean up what's in the head, so that way we can just treat everybody the same. But I think, you know, the thing that we're thinking about in my lab, and I guess my message, is that we really need to think about bias as being something that's in the culture, something broader. It's not only in people's heads, it also lives in the ways that people interact with each other. It lives in the values of the organization. It lives in the policies and the practices. And in order to make change, you can't just change one of those levels. You have to make simultaneous change to all those different levels of the culture. And I think when we think about bias as being a cultural phenomenon as opposed to an individual phenomenon, we can also start to see that the definition of bias as being disparate treatment is also, I think, too narrow. So we can't just think about, you know, are women and men being treated differently as the only way that bias manifests. That is one way that bias manifests. But you can have a culture that in which people are treated completely the same, but it could still be a biased culture if it values certain types of people or certain practices. So the example I like to give, just to make that clear, is you can think about like a meeting. You know, maybe an organization, people have meetings all the time, so maybe there's like a meeting with a team or a group, and the women are interrupted more than the men at this meeting, which is a finding that does happen. Women tend to get interrupted more than men. That's disparate treatment, so that's women being treated worse. But even if you get rid of that and you tell people, all right, we're just going to interrupt everybody equally now, you know, that's not going to necessarily solve the problem, because if you have a culture that values interruption, that the only way you get heard is to interrupt, or the people who are listened to are the ones who interrupt, that's also going to disadvantage women, because women are socialized not to interrupt, and if they do interrupt, they get backlash. And so just having a culture where the value is the interrupters are the ones who are heard, that's going to create a sense of disadvantage. So we really need to broaden the way we think about bias and the way we think about mistreatment, to also think about what we're calling it foundational androcentric bias, which is basically this idea that you can have bias even if you don't have unequal treatment, because the culture's been set up in a way that rewards and privileges male-typed behaviors that are typically associated with men more than women.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Dee Bernard. I'm an associate professor of sociology at Indiana University. Thanks so much for being here, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me and putting on this wonderful conference. I'll just kind of briefly mention some work I'm doing with some collaborators. We've been looking lately at cultural beliefs and stereotypes about Asian Americans. And we've been doing this in part because there is maybe less research on this group than you would expect. The way I end up doing some of my research is I assume a certain body of research exists, and then I want to do something that follows up on it. And then when you do the literature review, you realize everything you thought would be there is not there, and then you have to do it yourself. So there's certainly good research on Asian Americans. There's just not as much of it as you would think. And this probably is for a couple of reasons. One, I think there's a perception that Asian Americans are doing pretty well in the US. And that's true on some metrics. Asian Americans, depending on where you look in the salary distribution, they do relatively well on salary. They do well on representation in higher education. But on other metrics, they don't do so well. And one of the big ones is promotion into supervisory and managerial roles. So Asian Americans tend to be underrepresented both in their placement in those roles and then also in the number of people that they supervise. And so there's lots of different metrics you can use to cut up those kinds of responsibilities. And Asian Americans tend to be underrepresented on all those metrics. And also, if you look at the bottom end of the labor market, Asian Americans tend to have higher poverty rates than white Americans. And so it seems like there's something going on at both the top and the bottom of the labor market. And we wanted to look at the extent to which cultural beliefs or stereotypes might help us understand this. And so we've been trying to map out stereotypes of Asian Americans by a lot of different factors. So by gender, so are stereotypes of Asian American men and women different? By place of birth, so if you were native-born versus foreign-born. Income, so you're high income or low income, and also different Asian American ethnic subgroups. And so we look at the 5 largest Asian American ethnic subgroups in the US, which is people of Chinese, Korean, Filipino, Vietnamese, and Asian Indian descent. And we look at a broad range of work-relevant stereotypes, and one thing we find is that Asian Americans, there's a really, really strong disadvantage on perceptions about sociability. So Asian Americans are often assumed to be more socially awkward, less socially outgoing, also just less interested in having social interaction. And one thing that's important about this holds true for Asian Americans who are born in the United States. So it's not just that Asian Americans are assumed to have less familiarity with US culture, less facility with the English language. Even people who are born in the US are assumed to be less sociable. And there's they tend to cluster tightly with people who are foreign-born in terms of how they're perceived by other people. We also found, and the original goal of our research was to look at differences in Asian American ethnicities by a range of factors. Our goal wasn't specifically to look at social class, but we also found huge social class effects on perceptions of competence. So people from low-income backgrounds are assumed to be less competent, less intelligent, less confident, and disadvantaged in other kinds of measures, which creates this sort of matrix where high-income white Americans, men and women, tend to be perceived as competent and sociable and outgoing, and low-income white Americans are perceived as not competent, but still sociable and outgoing, and high-income Asian Americans are perceived as relatively competent, but not sociable, and then low-income Asian Americans are perceived as not very sociable and also not very, very competent. And there's not a lot of distinction across different kinds of ethnic groups in terms of the content of the stereotypes. And so we think this might help explain why Asian Americans might be doing well on some metrics, but also underrepresented in management and supervisory roles to the extent that being perceived as personable and outgoing and good at interacting and having a good social facility with other people is seen as important for management. Asian Americans might be underrepresented in those kinds of roles or seen as maybe not a good fit for those kinds of roles. We do find disadvantages in other factors that could be related to leadership, like perceptions of dominance and creativity, but they're not as big as the sociability gap. And so I think if I was going to think about some places inequality research would look next, I think it's good to look at the diversity of diversity itself. So groups might do well in some metrics, but be disadvantaged in other metrics, and it might, there's not just one kind of disadvantage, right? There's a lot of different kinds of disadvantage, and the content of stereotype varies a lot from group to group. And I would also suggest, I think it's useful that we talk more about social class. Social class doesn't get discussed very much. And I think it's potentially a really important axis of inequality. And there's a really interesting study on the wage gap in England that came out last year. And they found that people who are from working class backgrounds tend to have lower salaries than people who are not from working class backgrounds, net of their current occupation and job title and human capital and all these other factors. So there might be something about coming from a working class background that makes it harder for you to interact in these high status workplaces. And I know that's something we talk about a lot in university settings, like retention of students who are first generation college students. So I'll just stop here, but I think there are different axes of inequality we can talk about.
Wonderful, thank you. I think we have a lot of interesting strands. One thing I've noticed in this research space is that there's kind of two really big thorny problems here. One is understanding what's going on currently, and I think you all do wonderful work on that. And I think another is, how do we actually change things? Because cultural change is hard. If it were easy, we'd all be out there doing it all the time, right? And I think all of your research speaks some to both. And I'm curious if you could, I think Sapna especially really drew out nicely kind of how are we going to concretely change these things? I mean, even changing the posters on the wall can do that sort of thing. I'm wondering if everyone could just speak a little bit to how their research tries to nudge that needle a little bit. And I'll kind of open it up.
I can start.
Sure.
So my work is really focused on not only understanding why women are underrepresented, but also what you can do to change it, and changing culture is basically like the thing I'm going to say like 1,000 times in this panel, I can already tell. But one way to change culture is to change the environment, because people are reading in to the environments about what the culture is going to be like. You can walk into any organization, look at its lobby, and you're probably going to start drawing conclusions about the types of people that work there and whether or not you fit in. But that's not, you can't just do that. You can't just change your lobby and think that all of a sudden now you've gotten rid of all the problems. The stuff in the space is a cue or a proxy for what the culture is like. And if you change the proxy but you don't change the actual culture, then that's not really going to do anything. So I think in terms of how to actually make change, I think one really important thing is you have to be able to measure what you have right now. You have to know what you have so that you can change it. And I'll just say, I was talking about this at lunch. One of the things that we tried to do last year was try to develop a way that companies can actually measure how masculine their cultures are on these different levels. So not only what's going on in people's heads, give them a questionnaire or an implicit association test to see what their associations are with men and tech or whatever, but also how masculine are the policies, what's going on during meetings or interactions, how masculine is that, what are the values of the organization masculine. And I went to several tech companies, and a lot of them were like, this is great, we really need this. But then when it actually came down to being like, can I actually do it here? Can I actually like measure how masculine your culture is? Then I got a bunch of our legal departments won't let us. And so I think that's a big barrier to making change, at least in the corporate space. And the reason the legal departments won't let them is because they're worried that if they get a measurement of how masculine the culture is, then if somebody doesn't get promoted, they might sue, and then they have the grounds to say, well, you knew that this culture is masculine, you didn't do anything about it. So they don't want, I mean, the companies that I talk to don't want to actually know how masculine their culture is. And that's a very hard place from which to make change, because if you can't know, then how do you change? And if you do change, how do you know that you actually did something? You know, so I guess, you know, first thing is we have to measure it, and you know, that means getting around some of the barriers and bureaucratic issues that are being kind of thrown up, I think. Yeah.
Go ahead.
One of the challenges, let's say, to the research that I've been doing over the past 7 years is this sense of insider versus outsider and relative relationships of access to firms and platforms that I was interested in. And I will tell you that I had zero relationship, zero access, and mostly tried to fly under the radar. Sorry.
Just probably a connector, yeah. Okay, go ahead, sorry.
Facebook is watching. So anyway, you know, as a young graduate student, and by young I mean career-wise, okay, people, young career graduate student, I was really worried about what I perceived to be a deficit of the research, in that I didn't have any type of official channels or other kinds of mechanisms to do my data collection and my research through the front door, let's put it that way. And so one thing that I've been, you know, that I've raised on the other side of some of that original, the original first passes at the research, is that there's value to doing things other ways, other than with, you know, in partnership and with the blessing of the firm. Now, that's not to say that you can't have those, you can't exist in a number of relationships to your object of study. But in my case, it worked out better to not have any kind of official vetting, because I needed a certain buy-in from my participants around anonymity, around my promise to protect the kinds of things that they would share in terms of making it not able to be traced back to employers. Everybody was under an NDA, so to speak with me meant a violation of an NDA, and I took it very seriously. So for those who want to do research, you know, that involves firms that I would say have historically had an adversarial or just lack of a relationship with academic research that might challenge some of their principles and practices, there can be value for just going outside. And so my experience doing that, you know, I did try, at first I thought I would try another way, and I got absolutely no traction. And, you know, rather than view it as a failure, I kind of had to do a redesign there, and I think it led to a better outcome ultimately. Now, the interesting coda to that is that suddenly industry has interest in what I learned, perhaps in part because it can't be traced back, you know, to a particular firm in the way that you described. So that has worked out to my favor. I wish I could say it was all planned. It wasn't, but I do like to share that, you know, that experience of me shifting my own expectation around how to gain access to inspire, hopefully, other modes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If either of you want to speak to to instill cultural change. Yeah.
Yeah, I think these some really good ideas have been mentioned, like making sure you have the right metrics and thinking about the macro level culture change. I think also there's this question of, you can think about the real solution to these problems, which is a macro level cultural change. And I think sometimes that can seem like a little bit overwhelming if you're trying to think like, well, okay, so what can I do today if I can't change the culture? And so I think there's also more like, there's the individual level survival stuff, like if I'm an employee, what can I do? And there's also sort of like the mid-level stuff, like what can I do now in my own organization? And I think one thing that Aaron Cooper mentioned yesterday is making sure the standards we use are consistent and they don't shift during the hiring process or the promotion process. And it's so easy for this to happen. I mean, thinking about just watching academic hiring processes, not just hiring, but things like student admissions, it's really easy to suddenly bring up something that might be a legitimate criticism, it might not be, but it's a criticism that's only raised for certain candidates. And I think it's really important to have the discussion before you do that about what are the legitimate criteria, and then let's stick to them. Or if maybe you're not the person who gets to decide which discussions are had, but if you're on that committee, maybe you can bring up, hey, like this isn't something that we've applied to the other candidates, so why don't we go back through and look at all the other candidates and apply this criteria, which like doesn't always make you popular on the search committee, but I think is a good step. So I think culture change is the solution, but I think there's also the question like, what can you do maybe tomorrow if you don't have the capacity to change your organizational culture? And I think dealing with the shifting standards thing is something that there's a pretty straightforward approach to, and is pretty effective.
I teach a course called The Teaching of Psychology at Berkeley, and I was looking at the old syllabus before I took the course on, and there was a section on lecturing and a section on advising and a section on grading, and then there was a section that said diversity and other challenges. And it was funny because it was not only sort of like a subsection within the challenges section, but the fact that it was kind of a challenges section kind of puts boxes this issue, and this is a theme that we've heard throughout within sort of this sort of very problematic topic. We've heard the last speakers sort of say that oh, you're interested in diversity, great, go for it, and you go over there, kind of thing. So we've heard, and I know this, many chief diversity officers within organizations, they're in HR, they're isolated, they're asked to solve gargantuan problems with zero funding and zero actual influence in the processes that they take on. If there's one thing we know from psychology about culture change is what we've heard again, which is that the voices from the leadership really matters, and it's not just a matter of seeing the numerical diversity, up at the top. Of course, it's really important, but it's important to see the signals coming from the leadership at both the communication level, the personal level, as well as the structural level. So, as we heard, switching diversity officers out of HR, funding research related to the relational aspects of work. Many times people are asked to sort of find out about the company, but then there's the lawyers who speak, and then there's the non-disclosure agreements, and there's all these barriers to frankly doing our work, and we can have all the ideas we want about a wonderful workplace, but there's really got to be resources and buy-in from the top, and even buy-in feels like the wrong term. You've got to have true commitment. I'll just end on the note that I have been able to interact with several chief diversity officers, and we'll be like, yeah, we need to do this. Oh, the CEO will never, will never go for it. Or let's, can they say this? Oh, I don't know that he wants to get in the fray. Kind of ideas, and so we need to move beyond IIT. We need to do more research. We need to pay attention to the needs of different employees. But there needs to be some way of nudging with maybe slightly more force than usual our leadership in tech. And then there's got to be modeling. That's and again, I'm not the first one to say this today.
Well, thank you. I think one thing that I love about all of your statements and all of your work is that even though you might be very critical of this industry, you are still essentially optimistic. And I think many of us in this room we are here because we are optimistic that change is possible, right? I'm thinking back to my own work on studying the One Laptop Per Child project. I had this third-year crisis in graduate school, right? Like I think many PhD students have, of like, am I just going to tear this thing down? Am I only going to be a critic? What am I actually going to contribute? So I'd like you to maybe just briefly speak before we open it up for questions towards maintaining that optimism and maybe what you are feeling most optimistic about. Might be a lot to unpack there.
I'm happy to begin here. It's not exactly an optimism, but it's kind of a, I remember Larry Page saying, and forgive me if it's not Larry Page, but I think there may be some memory construction here going on. It may have been Mark Anderson. I don't know who it was. Okay, let's just. But somebody said the internet is going to be the great equalizer because the best ideas are going to rise to the top. Here we are. Welcome to this conference, and and the more things change, the more they stay the same, and it drives me in a very deep way. And it's not optimism. I'm not feeling optimistic in the current climate of intolerance, and I see very many of the processes. I feel like I can contribute something, and I feel like I can, in a very small way, make a difference. And one day someone is going to listen to me. And that's my optimism.
Thank you. Other thoughts? Go ahead, Tara.
I'm always raising my hand. I think that, I don't know if optimism is the right word, but I have to do some soul searching around what the point is of my research as well. And I worked so long in relative obscurity on these issues where I felt like I couldn't get the buy-in, and the work that I was doing, because it was challenging, wasn't going to be welcomed, and so on. And so when there has been a moment of late where it seems like there has been a change around the work's reception, I've had to ask myself, like, how do I see my role as an academic and as someone who's been doing criticism, fit in with the aims and goals of other parties, some of whom I write about. And I've had to think about that, and I guess if I'm not doing the work that I'm doing in order to make something better for those who participate in my studies and about whom I write, then I have to ask myself what the point is. So this is kind of like my own internal process. It seems like we're in this, I don't need to tell the crowd this, it seems like we're in a strange political, cultural, social moment right now for many reasons. But expressly around the social media platforms and firms, and again, I just want to say I'm talking about American-based, mainstream firms based down the road from here in particular, it seems like they have had a number of situations, gaffes, PR debacles, horrible instances that have alerted them to a problem. Now, a cynic's view might be that they see a very tangible dollar sign problem associated with these issues, and I mean that's certainly true. There is an impact on revenue generation when things go south for a firm. But that having been said, for whatever reason, and for many reasons, there seems to be this moment of opening for people like me, for my colleague Safiya Noble, who's recently moved to USC, who does work on racial bias in search, for example, and others who are doing work like this where suddenly the information we have is being solicited. And that's just that's in itself is a sea change for us in terms of our past experiences. So in the sense that that provides a level of optimism, I think it is encouraging. You know, tech firms are great at being tech firms, but there are social problems that are replicated, reified, and amplified at scale and scope, and I'm not sure that applying more technological solutions to what are essentially social problems will solve the problem. And when I say I'm not sure, I know, right? And so to recognize that there may be others with skill sets, with knowledge and information that could improve some of these situations is great. Although I was recently at an event where it seemed that there were a number of academics and industry people working together, and we were all sort of talking about the values that this firm had and how can we, you know, improve, you know, meet our values and so on. And I finally said, I might have stepped out for coffee during this part, but what are the values? Which values? And it was sort of this moment where they were like, ah, right. So, you know, I think one thing that academics can do in our role is help not only respond to some of these issues that firms are experiencing in a very real and acute way, but also bring to light, you know, not only respond to their questions about what are we doing wrong or, you know, what's going on here, but also ask different questions, reframe questions, raise other kinds of issues and values that maybe they don't put on the table necessarily, but in my role as an outsider in some regards, you know, I think I'm in a better position to do. And so I'm still trying to work through what it will look like for me to maybe partner with some industry people on some of these problems, and, you know, how not to lose your soul while you do that, right? But also, okay, if my goal is to improve things in this case for this group of workers worldwide, like, what's the evidence that I have that can help the firms actually get there, whether or not that's what they're asking me about. Thanks.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, whenever I need to feel optimistic, I try to think of the subcultures or the smaller departments and classrooms that have actually been able to make change. And there's like a physics teacher in Seattle who teaches a whole unit to his high school class on why there's an underrepresentation of blacks and Latinos in physics. And I'm like, that's so cool that he works that unit. Like, that's a unit that they do in their physics class, and they start talking about what are the reasons, and like, you know, that students read about it. So those kind of things make me feel hopeful. My favorite hopeful example is Harvey Mudd, which I know has been mentioned a couple times, but from my perspective, I think what they did that I think is so useful and valuable is they really took a hard look at their values, and they said, okay, what are we valuing here at Harvey Mudd Computer Science? And they realized that one of the things they had been valuing was prior programming experience. So the students who are coming in with prior programming experience were the students who are seen as better and smarter, and the ones who are more likely to get in the program and graduate from the program. And they realized that if they had that value, that was going to lead to gender disparities and racial disparities and lots of other disparities based on class. And so they said, okay, what would it look like for us to change that value on every level of our department? So that meant we're going to take the intro class, and we're no longer going to make it possible for students who have prior programming experience to be the ones who are doing better than the ones who don't. And so they split their intro class into two classes. You self-select into the class that has, for students who have less prior programming experience or more prior programming experience. It's not about who's smarter. The classes are valued the same way, and you self-select. So that means that if you think that you have a ton of experience, you go into the class with people who have experience. And they don't let the students in the class with the more experience get any further. They end up in the same place at the end. They kind of put in extra guest lectures to make sure that those students don't get further ahead. And so by the end of that year, the students are in the same place, and they've been able to make their introductory class for students with less experience a much less intimidating class, because now there's not the students who know everything by the first test. They're finishing their test in 15 minutes and they're answering every single question. So they addressed it on that kind of structural level. They also addressed it on their interactions level. So they have an explicit no show-off policy now in their department, where the faculty are actually, the only training they did, as far as I know, is that they train the faculty how to deal with the students who intimidate the other students. And they tell the students, I really like how passionate you are about this topic. I see that you know a lot about it, but you're intimidating other students. Can you come to office hours and we'll have these conversations in office hours instead? And so now they've been able to take that culture that used to be dominated by the students who had prior experience and make it more welcoming for everyone else. And then on top of that, they do other things like they send all their women majors to the Grace Hopper conference so they can be exposed to different types of role models and people who didn't, start programming when they were like 4 years old or whatever. So they really managed to take that value and address it on multiple levels of their culture and do it in a way that, they didn't start with training faculty, which is probably like the worst, the worst thing you can probably do is try to train faculty on like how to change something, tell them they're doing something wrong, and they're not gonna, that's not gonna work. They did it by making these structural changes and these changes on the interaction level, and now, they're, probably most of you know, but they went from graduating 10% of their degrees went to women in, I think it was just like 2005, and now they're at 50%, and they've been able to sustain that change. And so it was really this massive cultural change that they undertook at many levels. So there are places that we can look to for examples that have been successful, and we just need more people to be doing things like those places are doing.
Absolutely. Speak briefly to your optimism or how do you maintain it?
Yeah, I mean, there's always pushback against social change, and so if you had some overall graph of progress towards equality, it wouldn't look like this, right? It would look like, because there's always kind of like pushback, and then you have to get over the pushback. And so that's what I kind of keep in mind, when you kind of are feeling down and you get the big picture. And I think the smaller thing is, like the panelists have pointed out, we have a much bigger toolbox of stuff that works now than we did 20 or 30 years ago. And so we can, even though not every solution might work in every organization, we at least have a bigger toolbox of stuff we can try. So I think that's also on a practical level encouraging.
Thank you. With that, I would love to open it up to a discussion with all of you. We have our two microphone runners. Go ahead and raise your hand and we'll get you a mic.
So this has been really interesting. And I'm curious about just if you think about what kind of research you would love to be able to do if you had no limits of access or resources. So the companies are opening everything up, and you have all the money and RAs you have. What projects might you design in this space?
Anyone want to jump in first? Time to dream big.
Longitudinal tracking of employee well-being. One of the big problems that the pool that I'm interested right now, it's not their problem, but one of the structural problems around these workers is that it's often term limited and from an industry sector perspective, very fractured. Some workers even do the work on Amazon Mechanical Turk and other digital labor platforms, so there's very little means to kind of track and know about workers in a long-term capacity. And I haven't had the mechanisms on many vectors to do that kind of work, but that would kind of be a next level.
Other thoughts? All barriers were gone.
I'm happy to apply for a grant with anyone who knows how to do that.
I think, and this is in line, I'll remind people that I was talking about this idea from numerical to relational diversity. And so, akin with the idea that what we value is, the Ph.D. in computer science, and I think that the industry needs to come around to really focusing on the social factors that are driving the tech organizations, just like other organizations. And so, very similar to what you're saying, I would love climate surveys of multiple, that are cross corporation, because of course you can do sort of the study for one corporation, but when you have multiple industries, you can look at sort of the things that are similar across companies, and if you can quantify those, then you can get, then you can look at factors that differentiate companies and how those factors are related to important social factors. Those sort of like those fuzzy, warm like factors that are not tech. So that's what I would love to do.
Yeah, mine is similar too. I think I would start by trying to identify the team leaders or the managers who have done well, so with diversity, so recruiting and retaining a diverse team, and the team, measuring to make sure that the team members feel an equal sense of belonging on those teams, trying to understand what they do, and then trying to do it in other places and seeing which context makes those things work and which ones don't make those things work. So it's not going to be as easy as just taking, we know this from a lot of social psychology research, you can't just take something that works in one context, move it to another context, expect it's going to work all the time. There's going to be some contextual moderators that are going to make some things more and less likely to happen, but it's so hard to figure out what those contextual moderators are because you need the access to multiple contexts. So you need to study multiple teams or multiple companies in order to know, like, okay, when this context is happening, like, for example, when we have leadership support, these are the things that are going to work. When we don't have leadership support, these are the, but there's like a bazillion different factors. So trying to figure out, like, if you can get this like big flow chart, here's my organization. We have leadership support, but we don't have whatever, and we do have this. But okay, these are the things that are going to work. So trying to create some kind of map that you can develop by having access to multiple organizations.
Nice.
So everything that was just mentioned would be wonderful. Some other things that would be on my wish list would be, I think just and Rudy mentioned this earlier, but just if this data was public, so it'd be kind of crowdsourced and lots of different people could analyze the data and bring different insights, that would be great. That's, in sociology, we have these big data sets like, not just in sociology, things like the census and the general social survey that are updated every year, and you can analyze them and different people can bring different insights. Within firms, the capacity to do more randomized controlled trials and figure out which interventions work in different contexts would be wonderful. And a few researchers have been able to get this data, but another thing that would be really useful for studying hiring is the pool of people who applied but were not hired. And we've talked a little bit about the challenging of a lot of hiring happening through social networks, and that's really hard to measure because it's so informal, but if there's a way to get better data about what the pool looks like, that would be also really useful.
Thank you. Other questions for these folks? Or other thoughts about where you would like to see the research go?
In the current climate that we're in right now, are you guys worried that certain things are going to be taken away and it's going to hurt your research? Like, for instance, I think there was something about businesses having to report gender pay and things like that, and that getting turned off, and like, what is that going to do for research? Is it going to set it back? How do you guys counteract that?
Great question. Any thoughts?
So I think grant funding is something that's always on academics' minds, and I think there is concern about, what funding are we cutting? And my primary funding source is the National Science Foundation, and as far as I know, the Trump administration does not know NSF exists. so let's just keep it like that. Yeah, exactly. All indications are they don't know about it. So I think it's piddly in terms of budget compared to NIH, which they do know about. So I think that's probably what we're hoping for, is just like keep going under the radar. But trying to supplement that. We've been trying to think strategically. Well, if NSF disappears, how do we supplement that, and how do we do it in a way that we can still do the research we want to do without being constrained or impinged on by corporations that might have agendas, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that's like a really great point that you raised. I mean, my research individually doesn't get impacted by that, but as a person and a citizen and a human, that is really of great concern. One thing in the work that I do that's been an interesting experience is that although I'm kind of focused on US firms, so much of their activities and their responses to various issues are governed by the EU and by things that are going on legislatively in EU, like nation states, member states. So like in Germany, for example, there's legislation around hate speech that Germans demand be enforced by platforms like Facebook. So it's not, the United States in terms of regulation is not in the same place as someone like Germany, but Germany is a player and they are pushing. So while we're kind of seeing these trends in the US, like the one you bring up, there are other places in the world where that's not necessarily the case. So that's interesting too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this, in part, this concern about the NSF, for example, speaks to the importance of being able to talk about your research to very broad audiences, including people who might not necessarily have the same political orientation or just starting point in a lot of places in life, because I think it's important to explain like what the broad value of your research is and why it should exist. I think one good example is there's a survey called the National Survey of Adolescent Health and Sexuality. It's one of the few nationally representative surveys that has more fine-grained measures of sexual orientation and sexual orientation identity than like most of the big surveys sociologists have access to. It almost didn't exist because there was some feeling that the government shouldn't fund a study that had to do with adolescent sexuality, that was an inappropriate topic. But it's really one of the few like high-quality surveys we have about this topic that's nationally representative among young people. And it was really like a battle to get it funded. So I think one thing we can potentially do to help ourselves as social scientists is just think about how to talk broadly about our work and the value of it and why it has value for society more broadly.
And I'll just chime in with I think a note for optimism, which is that yes, the federal funding is certainly a concern, but here we're talking about the private sector, and people in the private sector can ask whatever they want about gender, and that's a really good thing. What we need are champions within that space. People, if I could just call out like Mitch and Frida Kapor, who are true champions of the work and really stand behind it. And there's a lot of people who are really sort of on the bandwagon, for example, around gender in tech, and there's a lot of money going behind it. There's complications around the implications for racial diversity, and I'm happy to talk about that. But I think there's what your question brings to my mind is the idea that one of the things that social scientists I think need right now is champions of the work within the tech sector.
Thank you. A great and very interesting panel. I don't want to end it on too unpleasant a note, but given that question about funding, not really since long before the publication of Masters of Deceit, we have had to deal with the question of research funded by people with a particular interest in the findings, and recent suggestions that Google has been attacking researchers who have supported regulation and offering to defund their work. I just wondered whether you felt in this area there is any or is a risk in some sense of work being funded with the aim of saying, look, we're a meritocracy, all these questions are, as with climate change, self-interest by people looking for funding and to attend conferences, etc. Excuse the pessimistic note.
Well, then I'm happy to amplify that a little bit. I feel like another element of the debate that recently took place was the way that the media tends to focus in on particular views of the tech industry. And it's not to say that those perceptions, those problems don't exist, but they tend to focus on a lot of negative stuff and ignore some of the positive stuff. So we might think about this question in terms of, what's the role of corporate funding, especially when there are strings attached potentially, and also what's the role of the media in its portrayals of the sorts of problems that come up, just to complicate things further.
I agree, we have to be careful, and I mean, I kind of look to, we have a model that didn't work, and now it's kind of, like the drug companies, that it's been, so I mean, I think in tech sometimes it's kind of an ahistorical field sometimes, like it's like, okay, we're inventing everything and we can do it better than anybody else has ever done it before. But this is an example of like, okay, why don't we look to places where we've had this conflict and learn from them about what worked and what didn't work, and do it slowly. This is another thing that's, I think, difficult about tech sometimes. It's that let's do it as fast as possible, and sometimes fast means you don't think about everything you need to think about. And yeah, and I mean, there was that New York Times article about Google giving laptops to every kid in Chicago or whatever that, and those are we should learn from these things about like, okay, you can do that. That seems like you can see why Google would want to do that, but then did they think about the fact that they probably would be making front page of the New York Times a year later because of this like major, potential conflict with, this is the first time that anybody's ever given hardware and software to kids, and now the teachers are doing, and so sometimes I think that in tech we need to slow down a little bit, think about consequences, and look for historical examples of times that everything has happened before. So why don't we look to those things and learn about those things so we can learn from those things?
Go ahead.
It's funny because I'm the one who rejected the optimistic label before, but I'm actually more optimistic in the sense that you've got an industry who prides itself and has a strong self-identified label of disruptor. And I think that there's a lot of common ground here in the ability to try to convince the funder that the product in and of itself is A, disrupting, and B, helps the either the bottom line, although there's questions around that, whether it's the argument about it's good for business, but simply about the productivity of workers and the environment surrounding retention of underrepresented employees. I mean, I think that there are I see it as much broader than what is the effect of our drug, right? I think that at least what we are focusing on is, can we keep our employees happy, right? Can we appeal to socioeconomic demographics that we haven't appealed to before? And with those arguments, you can begin to build a science, right? I think the knee-jerk reaction is, oh my gosh, we're going to get shown up. But the alternative framing is, look, we're acknowledging that we have an issue, and we are at the forefront of the revolution by our product.
So I'm afraid we are out of time. I'm very sorry, but save your question for the break. I think we are ready to move on to the next panel.
All right.
Thank you all so much for joining us. I really appreciate all of your expertise.